So I will be presenting our research on the differentiation of exceptions in category learning. So in the real world, there are many categories that involve diverse objects. For example, members of the mammal category commonly have 4 legs and live on land, but whales, as the exceptions, have fins and live in the water. Whales also perceptually resemble members of the competing fish categories. And despite these confusions, we can still distinguish whales from fish and classify them as mammals. So how do we acquire these categories with rule followers and exceptional items? Many past categorization models indicate that we represent rules and exceptions in a category separately. At the deeper level, these separate representations may arise through 2 neural operations called pattern integration and pattern differentiation. So to define, pattern integration involves the overlapping of objects' neural representations, while pattern differentiation involves a reduction in objects' representational overlap. Importantly, both operations occur through experience, allowing object representations in the brain to flexibly transform under different contexts. Past works have shown the involvement of these 2 operations in category learning without exceptions. So the learning can drive the integration of the within category stimuli and the differentiation of the between category stimuli, as shown by the figure here. So each cell represents the learning-induced change into stimulus pattern similarity, and R represents the rule followers, while the number beside R represents the specific stimulus in each category. When exceptions are introduced to the categories, there can be additional representational shifts. So a combination of neuroimaging, behavioral, and modeling works hint that the human brain can represent exceptions distinctively from the rule followers. Specifically, the brain may differentiate exceptions from rule followers in the same categories instead of integrating all the perceptually inconsistent members together. Also, exceptions can be differentiated from perceptually similar rule followers in the competing categories to avoid confusion. Although previous studies imply the differentiation of exceptions from rule followers, no one has yet to inspect the specific representational shifts in the learning process. So here, we want to elucidate the selective pattern integration and pattern differentiation that occur in rule plus exception category learning by using a late exception learning sequence. So with the sequence, we delay the introduction of exceptions in the category learning phase, such that we can compare people's object representations before and after exception learning. The comparison allows us to assess the representational shifts and to validate the differentiation between exceptions and rule followers. But how can we infer people's latent representations during the learning process? One way is to use a computational model that simulates human categorization process at the representational level. And the model we chose to use here is called Sustain. So during learning, Sustain can recruit these clusters tuned to selective features of the stimuli, such that each cluster represents some stimuli from a specific category. When classifying a stimulus, all the clusters are activated based on the degree to which the cluster's tuned features match with the stimulus' actual features and based on the relevancy of each feature dimension. Just like how the human brain can update objects' neural representations through experience, Sustain can alter stimulus cluster activation patterns through category learning, thereby having the capacity to simulate pattern integration and pattern differentiation. So we fitted this model to people's categorization performance before and after exception learning to infer the latent representational shifts and to inspect the pattern integration and differentiation. So with the delayed exception learning sequence and the computational models, we can decompose the process of rule plus exception category learning into operations at the representational level and discern whether there's pattern differentiation between the exceptions and rule followers. In our learning paradigm, we created 2 competing family resemblance categories with artificial animals that had 7 feature dimensions. 6 of the dimensions are category diagnostic, and the prototypes of the 2 categories had distinct values on these dimensions. Rule followers in each category shared 4 of the 6 values of their prototypes, while the exceptions shared 5 of the 6 values of the prototypes in the competing categories, which make them highly confusable. So we made the value of the 7th feature dimension vary between the exceptions and non-exception stimuli to make the exceptions more distinctive and make category learning easier. So overall, each category contained groups of rule followers and exceptions that had distinct perceptual patterns. And for the procedures, in the first half of the learning phase, participants learned only the prototypes and rule followers. And in an intermediate testing phase, they categorized these stimuli without feedback. And they also categorized novel rule followers in the testing phase. And then in the second half of the learning phase, participants were introduced with exceptions while continued learning the non-exception stimuli. Finally, in another testing phase, they categorized all the learned stimuli, novel rule followers, and novel exceptions. After collecting the behavioral data, we performed model fitting. So sustain was fitted to people's categorization accuracies in the first half of the learning phase and intermediate testing phase. From the fitted model, we extracted individual stimulus cluster activation patterns in the testing phase before exception learning. Then we fitted sustain to people's accuracies in the second half of the learning phase and final testing phase. And again, we obtained all the stimulus cluster activation patterns in the testing phase after exception learning. But before we examined these cluster activations, we checked if sustain was successfully fitted to people's behavioral data. In the testing phases, the 32 human participants recruited showed above-chance categorization performance for all types of stimuli, except the novel exceptions in the final testing phase. So people in general had difficulties generalizing learned information to unseen exceptions. And then sustain replicated people's testing performance pattern and was significantly predictive of individuals' categorization accuracies. Also, human participants' categorization accuracies for the non-exception stimuli in the intermediate testing phase predicted their accuracies for the same stimuli in the final testing phase, but was not correlated to their accuracies for the exceptions. So in other words, their performance on exceptions in the final testing phase was not linked to how they categorized the non-exception stimuli before exception learning. And again, sustain showed these similar patterns. So these pieces of findings help confirm that sustain did reflect people's behavioral performance. We then proceeded to perform representational similarity analysis on the cluster activation patterns to infer the representational shifts. Specifically, we computed correlations between stimulus cluster activations to generate these representational similarity matrices for the testing phases before and after exception learning. So in the 2 matrices here, each cell represents the pattern similarity between 2 stimuli, and a red color reflects a higher similarity, while a blue reflects a lower similarity. We then subtracted the 2 matrices to show the representational shifts during the exception learning, so the second half of the learning phase. And in the third matrix here, each cell represents change in the pattern similarity between 2 stimuli, with a red color reflecting an increase in the similarity and the blue color reflecting a decrease. We then used the matrices to compute the within and between category similarity scores for different types of stimuli by averaging their within and between category correlations, respectively. To determine if rule followers and exceptions underwent pattern differentiation during the learning process, we examined the changes in their within and between category similarities across the 2 testing phases. And also, to gain a comprehensive understanding of the representational dynamics in exception learning, we also check the changes in the pattern similarities of owning the rule followers and owning the exceptions. For results, we found that the within and between category similarities between the rule followers and exceptions significantly decreased across the intermediate and final testing phases. So the latent representations for these two types of stimuli became more distant from each other. And these results suggest that exceptions and rule followers undergo pattern differentiation between and within categories in the learning process. Also, there were significant increases in the within and between category similarities of only the rule followers. So in the representational space, similar rule followers were integrated. Similar rule followers in the same category were integrated together, and these similar rule followers from competing categories were integrated as well. This may be due to the introduction of the confusable exceptions that blur the category boundary and made distinct members across categories overlap more in the representational space. Moreover, through the exception learning, there was a significant increase in the within category similarity of owning the exceptions. So just like the rule followers, similar exceptions in the same category were integrated. And then there was a significant increase in the between category similarity of owning the exceptions. So again, this can imply the blurring of category boundary induced by exception learning. Combining findings from the current and previous slides, we show that rule followers and exceptions in each category were separately integrated while being differentiated from each other. In consequence, people may form distinct rule follower and exception clusters for each category in the representational space. And we can see these distinct clusters by performing multidimensional scaling on the similarity matrices. So the plot here shows how each stimulus cluster activation pattern is distributed on a two-dimensional plane. Before exception learning, exceptions as shown by the blue points were intermixed with rule followers as shown by the purple points from competing categories due to the perceptual overlap. But after exceptions were learned, these items formed their unique clusters away from rule followers within and between categories. These findings imply that the learning of rule plus exception categories can give rise to rule follower and exception clusters that are differentiated from each other in the representational space. And these separate clusters may act as subcategories that constitute a hierarchically structured category representation. The hierarchical structure may allow people to better recognize distinct perceptual patterns that characterize different category members and thus benefit the acquisition of complex categories. So in conclusion, our study demonstrates that exception learning not only drives pattern differentiation between rule followers and exceptions, but also leads to separate integration of these two types of stimuli. These selective operations may result in these hierarchical structured representations for the rule plus exception categories. In addition to these findings, we provide a novel computational approach for examining people's latent representational dynamics underlying category learning. This approach can be extended to dissecting the learning of other types of categories and can be used to predict activities in brain regions involved in the learning process, like the hippocampus. Overall, by examining category learning at the representational level, we can understand the operations fundamental to this cognitive process and gain insights into how people acquire those sophisticated categories in the real world. This is the end of my talk. Thank you everyone for listening, and thanks to all the people who have contributed to our project.